guys, so by far the most widely used chord progression in jazz is the 12-bar blues. And the next most widely used chord progression in jazz are rhythm changes. Now, rhythm changes are a set of chord changes based on Gershwin's song, I Got Rhythm. Now in this video, I'm going to go through rhythm changes, break it down for you, show you sort of bit by bit how it's constructed, and you'll see that it's actually quite a simple chord progression, and then give you a few other jazz standards that use rhythm changes. So first, let's go through the technicalities. I Got Rhythm was originally a 34-bar song consisting of a 32-bar song with kind of a 2-bar outro at the end. Now, because of this sort of irregular number of bars, being 34 instead of 32, generally rhythm changes or other songs based on rhythm changes drop that 2-bar outro and just have a standard 32-bar song. I Got Rhythm is also in a standard AABA form and is originally in the key of B flat. Now, it's important to understand that there's no single rhythm changes progression. It can actually be a number of different chord progressions, all of which are based off the original I Got Rhythm chord progression, just with a whole bunch of chord substitutions. Now, the original I Got Rhythm actually has a really simple and therefore very flexible chord progression, and that's precisely what makes it so popular. You can actually do quite a lot with the chords of I Got Rhythm. And it's very much like the 12-bar blues in that there is sort of your standard bass 12-bar blues, the 1-4-1-5-4-1, but then there are countless variations on that bass 12-bar blues to make it a bit more interesting and a bit more sort of adventurous. Anyway, so let's begin looking at rhythm changes and really break it down and have a look at each part. And let's begin with the A section, which is 8 bars long. Now, at its absolute simplest, at its absolute sort of base and bare bones minimalistic level, the A section is really just a 1-5-1-5 progression. So in bar 1, we start on the tonic, the B flat, then we go to the 5 in bar 2, back to the 1 in bar 3, back to the 5 in bar 4, and so on. So really it's just a 1-5-1-5-1 progression for 8 bars, right? Really, really simple and really harmonically strong because it's a 5-1 progression, which is a really strong and powerful sort of progression or perfect cadence, if you like. Now, a common chord substitution for a B flat major or a B flat 6, which is what I'm playing here, is a G minor 7. Now that's just a simple median note substitution, and as you can see in the picture-in-picture, all the notes are the same. All the notes in B flat 6 are also in G minor 7, and that's why the chord substitution works so well. And a common chord substitution for the F7 is a C minor 7, and that's because it creates a 2-5 relationship between the two chords. So from C minor 7 to F7 is a 2-5, which is a really widely used sort of little mini chord progression. So now we can take our rhythm changes base, the 1-5-1-5 progression, and make it slightly more interesting by inserting these chord substitutions. And we can turn it into a 1-6-2-5 chord progression. So now our rhythm changes chord progression goes B flat major to G minor 7 to C minor 7 to F7. And then it just repeats those 2 bars for the full 8 bars. And so that's just a 1-6-2-5. Now, at its heart, this is what rhythm changes are. It's just a repeated 1-6-2-5 chord progression. And while 1-6-2-5 progressions were used well before I Got Rhythm was written, for whatever reason, I Got Rhythm has become sort of synonymous with this 1-6-2-5 chord progression. So now this 1-6-2-5 chord progression, which itself is just a 1-5-1-5 chord progression, just with a couple chord substitutions, this is the simplest variant of a rhythm changes progression. Although interestingly, it's not yet the exact chord progression used in I Got Rhythm, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this sort of simplified rhythm changes, the just repeated 1-6-2-5 progression, is found in songs like Don't Be That Way, Lester leaps in. So we've got the bass rhythm changes, and then we put in a couple chord substitutions to create what I call the simplified rhythm changes. And now we can go further and add even more chord substitutions to make our progression a little bit more interesting again. So now we're going to leave all the bars the same except for bars 5 and 6, where we're going to replace the usual 1, 6, 2, 5 with a B flat major to B flat 7 to E flat major to E flat minor. So breaking that down, we see that the first chord stays the same. Then instead of the G minor 7, we play a B flat 7, where 3 of the 4 notes in the G minor 7 stay the same, so that's a pretty good substitute. Then instead of the C minor 7, we play an E flat 6, which has all the exact same notes, so that's a pretty good substitute. And then instead of the F7, we play an E flat minor 7. Now, an E flat minor 7 isn't a perfect substitute for the F7, but it acts as a kind of turnaround to get us back to the B flat major. So now, having chord substituted those 2 bars and left all the other bars the same, we now have the original I Got Rhythm chord progression. And that goes as follows. Now this chord progression is also used in songs like Daphne, or Cottontail, or Anthropology, or Olio. Now, I was using the original rhythm changes over all of those songs, but really a lot of those songs don't use the original rhythm changes. Instead, they take that chord progression and add even further chord substitutions to make it even more harmonically interesting and complex. Now, up here in the picture-in-picture, I've written out a whole bunch of further chord substitutions you can do over the original rhythm changes to create sort of more interesting, more nuanced, and more sort of sophisticated versions of these same rhythm changes. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these as you can see them in the picture-in-picture, but just quickly you can do things like, changing the G minor 7 to a G7, changing the C minor 7 to a C7, changing the B flat major to a D minor 7. Then you can get walking bass lines by doing stuff like B flat major to B diminished, which is just a substitute for G7, to C7 to C sharp diminished, which is just a substitute of A7, which then goes to the D minor 7, and to the G7, C minor 7, F7. Then in bar 5 you can play an F minor 7 in place of the B flat 6, or just a B flat 7 for the whole bar. And again, you can get a walking bass line by doing things like B flat 6 to B flat 7, first inversion, to E flat 6 to E diminished, to B flat 6 again, but with the F at the bottom, then to G minor 7, C minor 7 to F7. Or similarly, you can get a descending walking bass line. Something like that. Then you can have just a simplified outro at the end of your A section, so just going 1, 5, 1 instead of 1, 6, 2, 5. So hopefully you can see all of those chord progressions are derived from that original rhythm changes chord progression, which is why all of these different variants can be called rhythm changes. Now the only chord progressions that are a little bit different are the last two rows of bars 1 to 4. Now the first one goes F sharp 7 to B7 to E7 to A7 to D7 to G7, C7, F7, and then to B flat in bar 5. And the second one goes B flat 7, A flat 7, G flat 7, F7, and then just repeats. Now each of these chords aren't substitutions for particular chords in the original rhythm changes chord progression, but rather the whole 4-bar chord progression has been substituted for a whole new chord progression. And while each chord by itself doesn't really make sense, in that an F sharp 7 doesn't really make sense as a substitute for a B flat 6, in the context of the entire substituted chord progression, it makes sense because it's done in a structured way. For example, that first row just goes down in a cycle of fifths, from the F sharp to the B, E, A, D, G, C, F. So because you're going down through the cycle of fifths, it's done in a structured way. So that's an acceptable sort of chord progression substitution. Similarly, that the second one with the B flat to the A flat, G flat, F is also, because it's repeated and because it's just moving down in steps, it's substituting a whole new structured chord progression in for the original rhythm changes chord progression. And so that's perfectly acceptable, and that's still technically rhythm changes because you're ending up back on that B flat in bar 5, and then you sort of continue with the chord progression as it was sort of written out originally. Now section B of I Got Rhythm is actually really simple, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. The entire point, or the entire goal of section B, is to go through a chord progression and end up on F7 in the last bar of section B. And of course, the reason you want to end on the F7 is because it's the 5 of B flat major, which is the first chord of the A section, which you're going to sort of next. So you end up having a 5, 1, going from the B to the A section. Now the original I Got Rhythm just goes through a dominant cycle of fifths, or sort of multiple secondary dominants. But essentially it goes 2 bars of D7 to 2 bars of G7 to 2 bars of C7 to 2 bars of F7, thus finishing on the F7. But other common sort of substitutions of that is turning those dominants into 2 5s, so going A minor 7 to D7, D minor 7 to G7, G minor 7 to C7, C minor 7 to F7. Then you can put in tritone substitutions, so you can do something like D7 down to D flat 7, down to C7, down to B7, which is a tritone substitution of the F7, so that's ready to go back to the B flat in section A. Or you can start sort of further up the cycle of fifths, for example, starting on the A7, then going down to the D, the G, and then 1 bar of C and F to get you back to the B flat. Or you can go even further up, start on the E7, and then you can do, say, tritone substitutions, go E flat to D flat to C to B. Right, so there are a number of different ways or substitutions that you can put in over the B section. And essentially all you really want is to go through some kind of dominant cycle of fifths pattern in order to finish on the F7. So all of these different variants and different chord progressions are all called rhythm changes because they're all based off the original I Got Rhythm chord progression. So as you can see, it's quite a broad sort of category. And a rhythm changes song doesn't necessarily have to use both sections A and B of rhythm changes. Many songs just use section A of rhythm changes and then use a different section B, completely unrelated. And many other songs use only section B from rhythm changes and then a completely different section A. And all of these sort of parts can be classified as rhythm changes. So then in conclusion, all that rhythm changes really are is having a repeated 1-6-2-5 chord progression in your A section, and then a dominant cycle of fifths leading back to the tonic in your B section. and then with a whole bunch of different chord substitutions which you can put over the top. Now, as I said, rhythm changes are used in a lot of jazz standards, and I've written out a few of them up here in the picture-in-picture. And even what I've explained to you in this video isn't exhaustive. There are other sort of variations and combinations and permutations of all these sort of chords and ideas that can still be technically classified as rhythm changes. For example, Thelonious Monk's Rhythm-a-ning. Right, so that song starts off not with a 1-6-2-5, but with the chord progression found in bars 5 and 6 of the original rhythm changes. So going B flat to B flat 7, E flat 7 to E diminished, and then doing the 1-6-2-5. And so that's another interesting example of what you can do with rhythm changes. Cool, so hopefully that gives you a general overview of what rhythm changes are, how to think about them, how to identify them. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and again, feel free to leave any questions or comments, and if you feel I've left anything out here or you'd like me to cover any particular area in more depth, feel free to leave a comment. Thanks guys, see ya.